Even those who swore allegiance to him feared him. In 40 BC, Rome crowned a stranger king. In 37 BC, he took Jerusalem. And from that moment on, sleep disappeared from the palace. Jerusalem, late at night. The temple courtyard is silent. Only the echo of guards' footsteps slips between the columns. But nearby, in the royal palace, the lamps are still burning. The king is awake. He turns a signet ring slowly in his fingers. The metal catches the light. He studies it as if it belonged to someone else. Then he whispers, almost to himself, "Now it's mine." His name is Herod. And for many in Judea, that name already sounds like an insult. He is not one of them. Herod is an Idumean by birth, descended from a people once conquered and forcibly converted to Judaism. He does not belong to the ancient royal line. He does not carry sacred blood. Rome gave him the crown, not God, not the people. Songs spread through the city. Quiet at first. Then louder. A king of foreign blood. A king without a home. And Herod hears them. Politics brought him here. First as a governor under Roman protection. Then as an ally of Mark Antony. When Antony fell to Octavian, Herod did not flee. He crossed the sea and stood before the victor himself. Ancient historians describe the moment with admiration. Instead of begging for mercy, Herod offered usefulness, loyalty, stability, taxes. Augustus believed him, and Judea paid the price. Imagine it, a man who chose the right master twice, and survived both times. But survival is not legitimacy. The priests see him as a usurper. The people see him as Rome's shadow. And Herod understands something crucial. As long as he is seen as a stranger, the throne beneath him is never solid. So he chooses the only solution he believes can cleanse blood: marriage. He marries Miriam, a Hasmonean princess, granddaughter of the high priest. Her family once ruled Judea by divine right. Her lineage is sacred. His is questioned. To Herod, she is not just a wife. She is proof. If he cannot change who he is, he will bind himself to what the people revere. But from the very beginning, something goes wrong. Miriam does not love him. Worse, she does not hide her contempt. At court, everyone sees it. The way Herod looks at her as if she were an icon, and the way she withdraws from his touch. For a man obsessed with recognition, this distance is unbearable. And slowly, a dangerous thought takes root. If love cannot secure the throne, fear will. This marriage, meant to save his rule, will become the wound that never closes. The marriage that was meant to legitimize his rule became its greatest threat. At court, Miriam was more than a queen. She was a living reminder that power once belonged to someone else. Her family, the Hasmoneans, had ruled Judea as high priests and kings. Their blood carried memory, authority, and divine favor. And as long as they lived, Herod's crown looked borrowed. At first, the danger was subtle. A glance held too long. A whisper in the temple courts. A name spoken with too much affection by the crowd. Then it became impossible to ignore. Among Miriam's relatives was her younger brother, Aristobulus. Barely out of boyhood, handsome, educated, and, most dangerously, legitimate. When Herod appointed him high priest, Jerusalem erupted in celebration. Josephus records that the people followed him through the streets, praising his lineage openly. Herod watched from the palace. He had given the boy the title to control him. Instead, he had given the people a symbol. And symbols are more dangerous than swords. Soon, rumors reached the king that the people preferred the Hasmonean heir. That priests spoke his name with reverence. That Rome might one day find him convenient. Whether these rumors were true no longer mattered. Herod invited Aristobulus to a banquet in Jericho. Wine flowed. Music filled the halls. Laughter echoed against marble walls. Nothing suggested danger. Later that night, during a visit to the palace baths, guards held the young man under the water. Josephus describes it plainly. The high priest drowned during a celebration meant to honor him. Herod ordered public mourning. He wept openly. He walked behind the body as if grief itself were his defense. Some believed him. Most did not. But something changed that day. This was not an execution after trial. Not punishment after rebellion. It was preventative murder. From that moment on, fear became policy. One by one, Miriam's relatives were accused of conspiracy. Uncles, cousins, advisors. Official charges were always the same: treason, disloyalty, plotting against the king. The real crime was simpler. Their blood reminded Herod of what he was not. Power and fear now moved together. And Herod learned a terrible lesson, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. Killing enemies brought silence. But it did not bring peace. Instead, it taught him that survival required constant vigilance. That hesitation was weakness. That mercy could be fatal. Even in moments of victory, he no longer slept. The palace was full. And yet, the king was alone. Herod understood something his enemies did not. Blood silences rivals. But stone speaks to history. After the death of Aristobulus, fear ruled the palace. But outside its walls, resentment grew. Executions created obedience, not loyalty. And Herod knew that fear alone would not keep a kingdom standing. So he turned to something older than dynasties. Stone. Around 20 to 19 BC, nearly 2 decades into his reign, Herod announced the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Not a repair. Not an addition. A transformation on a scale unseen in Judea. For the people, this was sacred ground. For Herod, it was a test. Ancient sources describe his obsessive caution. Stones were cut far from the Temple Mount so that no iron tools would defile the holy site. Only priests trained in ritual purity were allowed near the inner sanctuaries. Herod personally approved plans, timelines, and materials, not as a believer, but as a man who understood symbolism. If he could not inherit holiness, he would manufacture it. The temple rose higher, brighter, grander than before. Josephus writes that its white stone reflected sunlight so intensely that pilgrims approaching Jerusalem had to shield their eyes. For a moment, it seemed that Herod had succeeded. The people rejoiced. They prayed. They wept. But prayer is not forgiveness. Almost simultaneously, Herod began another project, one that made his loyalties look unmistakable to Jerusalem. On the Mediterranean coast, he ordered the construction of Caesarea Maritima, a Roman city in Jewish land. Built not for worship, but for empire. Archaeology confirms what ancient writers hinted at. Roman engineers used experimental hydraulic concrete, poured directly into the sea, to create massive harbor blocks. This technology allowed the harbor, named Sebastos, in honor of Augustus, to function in open water, something rarely achieved in antiquity. It was a marvel. And a message. Statues of Augustus stood where Jewish law forbade images. A theater hosted Roman spectacles. Latin inscriptions appeared beside Herod's name. To Rome, Caesarea proclaimed loyalty. To Jerusalem, it proclaimed betrayal. He builds for himself, not for God, people whispered. They were not wrong. Herod had learned that Rome did not care about bloodlines. It cared about order, taxes, and stability. And he delivered all three. But loyalty to Rome deepened his isolation at home. The temple had won him admiration. Caesarea earned him suspicion. And somewhere between those two cities, Herod realized a terrifying truth. Stone could make him powerful, but it could never make him loved. The temple was built for God. Caesarea was built for Rome. But there were places Herod built for only one person: himself. Far from Jerusalem, beyond the cities and the crowds, Herod chose isolation. In the wilderness, where the land itself seems hostile, he began constructing what would become the clearest reflection of his inner world: Masada. A fortress perched on a sheer cliff above the Dead Sea. Wind howls there constantly, tearing at clothes and skin alike. From below, it looks unreachable. From above, it feels like the end of the world. This was not built because an invasion was already at the gates. Judea was not facing an immediate siege. Masada was not meant to repel an army. It was meant to buy time. Archaeology reveals a place designed for endurance, massive cisterns carved into rock, capable of storing rainwater for years, storerooms sealed against heat and decay, living quarters hidden deep within stone. Supplies that could outlast sieges no one had yet planned. Masada was not a fortress of war. It was a fortress of escape. Ancient sources say Herod never slept in the same room twice. That servants were forbidden to know his route through the palace. Whether legend or truth, Masada explains the fear behind such stories. A king who trusts stone more than people has already lost half the battle. And then there was Herodion. South of Jerusalem, Herod ordered an entire hill to be reshaped. Earth was piled up, stone carved away, until the landscape itself became artificial. From a distance, it looked like a natural mountain. It was not. Herodion was a palace, a fortress, and something else entirely. A monument. Inside were gardens, pools, banquet halls decorated with frescoes and mosaics in the Roman style. Beneath them, his tomb. Herod decided, long before his death, where he would be buried. Josephus records that he named the site after himself. Herodion. An entire mountain created to repeat one word. This was no longer architecture of power. It was architecture of ego. Masada held his fear. Herodion held his name. And between them stood a man who could not imagine a world without himself in it. Herod had built cities for emperors and temples for God. But only in the desert did he reveal the truth. He was not preparing to rule forever. He was preparing to disappear safely. For a brief moment, it seemed as if Herod could be more than a tyrant. A great famine struck Judea. Crops failed. The land cracked under the sun. Bread became scarce, and hunger reached even the city walls. Herod responded swiftly. Ancient sources describe how royal storehouses were opened. Grain was distributed to the people. Bread was purchased in Egypt and brought across the desert. To fund the effort, Herod ordered silverware from the palace melted down, a gesture meant to signal sacrifice. The lines were long. People thanked him. Some even blessed his name. From a distance, it looked like mercy. But mercy offered from a throne never comes without expectation. Historians note that Herod's generosity always followed unrest. It was calculated, measured, and remembered. In Rome, such acts were openly called what they were: the purchase of loyalty. In Judea, it was called kindness. People ate. They survived. But they did not forget who controlled the granaries. Every loaf carried a reminder: the king sees everything. Gratitude became a form of obedience. Silence became safety. Herod had learned another lesson. Fear breaks resistance. Generosity prevents rebellion. Together, they form control. And yet, even this could not buy affection. When the famine passed, hunger left the streets, but suspicion remained. People spoke carefully. Prayers were whispered. Praise was given without warmth. A blessing spoken out of fear has no power. Herod stood above a fed people. And still stood alone. Fear changes a man slowly. Almost imperceptibly. By the time Herod reached old age, the palace no longer felt like a place of power. It felt like a listening chamber. Servants moved quietly. Advisors chose words with care. Silence had become safer than speech. The king no longer trusted anyone, especially those closest to him. And above all, Miriam. She had once been the solution to his problem. Now she was the proof that the problem could never be solved. Miriam did not change. She did not soften with time. She did not learn submission. Her dignity remained intact, and that alone was enough to provoke him. Josephus writes that Herod loved her obsessively. But obsession is not devotion. It is ownership mixed with fear. At court, whispers spread like smoke. That Miriam mocked the king behind closed doors. That she cursed him. That she planned to flee. That she had taken a lover. Most of these accusations were never proven. Some were likely invented. But proof no longer mattered. Suspicion had replaced evidence. Herod hesitated. For once, he delayed the decision. Advisors were consulted. Witnesses were heard. And yet, every word spoken against her confirmed what he already believed, that she represented a threat he could not control. So he ordered her execution. Not as a rebel. Not as a conspirator. But as a danger. When Miriam was put to death, the palace did not celebrate. There were no cheers, no relief. Only a strange stillness, the kind that follows an irreversible act. And then, something in Herod broke. Ancient sources describe a man unraveling. He wandered the palace calling her name. He ordered servants to dress women in her clothes, to let him see her again. At times he sat motionless, staring into nothing, whispering, "I didn't want this." From that moment on, fear no longer protected the throne. It consumed it. The woman he had killed to secure power became the wound that never healed. And the palace, once a fortress, turned into a cage built from memory. After Miriam's death, the palace never returned to normal. Herod had removed the woman he loved most, and in doing so, destroyed the last boundary between suspicion and cruelty. From now on, no relationship was safe. Not even blood. Especially blood. Miriam's sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, had grown into young men. Educated in Rome. Intelligent. Charismatic. And, fatally, legitimate. They carried what their father never could, Hasmonean blood. People noticed. They whispered. In Jerusalem, names still mattered. And the names of Miriam's sons were spoken with a reverence their father had never earned. Herod heard everything. At first, he watched. Then he questioned. Then he suspected. Letters were intercepted. Conversations reported. Every gesture reinterpreted as ambition. Advisors warned him of plots. Some were likely real. Many were not. But by now, Herod no longer distinguished between danger and possibility. Josephus records that the king brought his own sons to trial, not in Judea, but before Roman authority. Even in this, he sought legitimacy from elsewhere. The accusations were grave: conspiracy, treason, intent to overthrow the king. Alexander and Aristobulus defended themselves. Witnesses contradicted one another. Doubt lingered. But doubt had no power anymore. Herod ordered their execution. 2 sons. 2 heirs. 2 reminders of a woman he could not forget. They were strangled in Samaria. When news reached Rome, even Augustus was shaken. A later Roman tradition puts a dark joke in the emperor's mouth. "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." The joke spread across the empire. And it outlived the king. From that moment on, Herod ruled over silence. There were no rivals left. No heirs to fear. No one to blame. Only the echo of his own decisions. He had killed his wife to protect his throne. He had killed his sons to protect himself. And in doing so, he ensured that nothing remained worth protecting. After the execution of his sons, Herod no longer ruled the kingdom. He guarded it. The palace fell silent. Laughter disappeared. Even musicians played softly, as if sound itself might provoke punishment. Servants walked on tiptoe. Advisors spoke in fragments. Every conversation felt overheard, because it often was. Herod trusted no one. Guards were placed at every door. Food was tasted before reaching his table. Bedding was changed several times a day. Locks were checked, then checked again. Masada stood ready. Herodion waited in the distance. And yet none of it brought peace. Around this time, the king's body began to betray him. Ancient descriptions are unforgiving. Josephus writes of a humiliating, agonizing illness that stripped Herod of dignity and control, spreading pain through his body while he was still alive. Physicians were powerless. They advised him to seek relief at the hot springs near the Dead Sea. Perhaps mineral waters, they said, could restore balance. He agreed. When his body was lowered into the pool, he screamed. The water burned him. It was as if the earth itself rejected him. After that, Herod no longer asked to be healed. Death had entered the palace, not suddenly, but patiently, like an advisor who never leaves. And still, he clung to power. He rewrote his will again and again. During his lifetime, Herod changed his heirs repeatedly, appointing sons only to later execute them. Succession became another instrument of fear. Now only one son remained, Antipater. Even him, Herod did not trust. When reports reached the king that Antipater planned to poison him, he ordered his arrest. The son was imprisoned. Evidence was gathered. The king hesitated. But when Herod learned that Antipater had celebrated rumors of his death, hesitation vanished. "Execute him immediately," he whispered. The order was carried out 5 days before Herod himself died. Even Augustus was stunned. Did he really leave no living heir? Yes. He did not. After the execution of his sons, Herod no longer ruled the kingdom. He guarded it. The palace fell silent. Laughter disappeared. Even musicians played softly, as if sound itself might provoke punishment. Servants walked on tiptoe. Advisors spoke in fragments. Every conversation felt overheard, because it often was. Herod trusted no one. Guards were placed at every door. Food was tasted before reaching his table. Bedding was changed several times a day. Locks were checked, then checked again. Masada stood ready. Herodion waited in the distance. And yet none of it brought peace. Around this time, the king's body began to betray him. Ancient descriptions are unforgiving. Josephus writes of a humiliating, agonizing illness that stripped Herod of dignity and control, spreading pain through his body while he was still alive. Physicians were powerless. They advised him to seek relief at the hot springs near the Dead Sea. Perhaps mineral waters, they said, could restore balance. He agreed. When his body was lowered into the pool, he screamed. The water burned him. It was as if the earth itself rejected him. After that, Herod no longer asked to be healed. Death had entered the palace, not suddenly, but patiently, like an advisor who never leaves. And still, he clung to power. He rewrote his will again and again. During his lifetime, Herod changed his heirs repeatedly, appointing sons only to later execute them. Succession became another instrument of fear. Now only one son remained, Antipater. Even him, Herod did not trust. When reports reached the king that Antipater planned to poison him, he ordered his arrest. The son was imprisoned. Evidence was gathered. The king hesitated. But when Herod learned that Antipater had celebrated rumors of his death, hesitation vanished. "Execute him immediately," he whispered. The order was carried out 5 days before Herod himself died. Even Augustus was stunned. Did he really leave no living heir? Yes. He did not. As death approached, Herod became obsessed with one thought. Not judgment. Not legacy. Silence. He knew the people hated him. He knew that when he died, Judea would breathe easier. And that terrified him more than illness ever had. So he devised his final command. Josephus records one of the most chilling orders in ancient history. Herod commanded that the most respected men of Judea, nobles, elders, leaders of prominent families, be arrested and imprisoned in the hippodrome at Jericho. They were not accused of crimes. They were not tried. They were hostages. His instruction was clear. The moment he died, they were to be executed. Not for punishment, but for spectacle. Herod wanted the country to weep on the day of his death. If not for him, then at least because of him. This order was never carried out. His sister Salome and her husband ignored it once the king was gone. But the fact that it was conceived at all says more than any legend. The man who rebuilt the temple ended his life planning a massacre, not out of rage, but out of fear of being unlamented. In his final days, Herod asked for a sword to be brought to him. He examined the blade carefully. "It is sharp, my king," the soldier said. "Good," Herod replied. "For I wish to die as a king, not as a corpse." Shortly after, he could no longer speak. The palace waited. Herod died in 4 BC. not in battle, not in glory. In Jericho, surrounded by guards, physicians, and silence. Josephus writes that when the king finally died, birds circled above the city. The heat pressed down. Dust rose from the road as his body was carried toward Herodion, the mountain built to hold his name. There, in a red stone sarcophagus, he was buried in the tomb he had designed for himself. No public mourning followed. No prayers filled the streets. Only quiet. Rome divided his kingdom among the sons he had not yet managed to kill. His name remained in administrative records, stripped of humanity, a label, not a man. And then another story emerged. The Gospel of Matthew speaks of the massacre of the innocents, a command attributed to Herod, ordering the death of children in Bethlehem to eliminate a newborn king of the Jews. Josephus does not mention this event. Many historians doubt it occurred as described. But even as a legend, it rings true in a different way. It captures the essence of his reign. A king who ruled through fear would eventually fear even birth itself. Herod wanted to be remembered as a builder. He was remembered as a warning. His temples still draw the eye. His cities still rise from the earth. But his true legacy is invisible. It is the understanding that power built on fear can shape stone, but never loyalty. That monuments can outlast men, but not redeem them. And that a throne guarded by suspicion will eventually collapse inward. Stone can hold water. Stone can hold grain. But stone cannot hold the heart. And that is why Herod lost everything that mattered, long before he died.